Slave breeding, medical experimentation, and rampant human trafficking. Such inhumane practices spanned for centuries, not just in the Americas, but through various countries all around the world. Slavery is a sin that some want to forget, and a truth that we must refuse to let die. It is a chapter in human history full of immense suffering and injustice. These stories have been buried within time and hidden beneath tales of progress. But we must dig into these stories so we may reflect on them, as one must remember the mistakes of history so such may never be repeated. That said, let us sail into this journey of remembrance and commemoration for all of our brothers and sisters who suffered through the harsh eras of slavery. That said, let's open our hearts to remembrance as we take a look at 25 historical facts about slavery that are certainly haunting. Give this video a like to show your support and subscribe so you can always be part of our insightful discussions. With that, let's begin. Number 1. Slave breeding. A horrifying practice that came shortly after the abolition of the Atlantic slave trade. And yes, it is as terrible as it sounds. Because slave owners could no longer import slaves from Africa, these people, with their greed and cruelty, devised slave breeding as a new, abhorrent practice to increase their workforce and profits. Simply put, slave breeding was the systematic forcing of slaves to have children to increase the wealth of their owners. Slave owners would select enslaved men and women for breeding based on perceived desirable traits, such as physical strength or perceived fertility, and would sometimes offer rewards for enslaved women who bore many children or punish those who resisted. This abhorrent practice not only violated the basic human rights of enslaved people, but also tore families apart. Children born into slavery were often separated from their mothers at a young age, sold, or put to work. Number 2. Medical experimentation. During the antebellum period in the United States, enslaved individuals were often subjected to painful and dangerous procedures without their consent, their bodies seen as expendable resources for medical research and experimentation. One notable example of this was the work of Dr. James Marion Sims. Known as the father of modern gynecology, Sims conducted numerous experimental surgeries on enslaved women without anesthesia. Despite the excruciating pain and potentially life-threatening nature of his experiments, Sims legally needed permission only from the enslaved women's owners. He performed painful experiments without anesthesia on Lucy, an enslaved black woman, while other doctors observed. Sims' experiments on Lucy were unsuccessful and nearly killed her due to severe blood poisoning. Nevertheless, he continued performing procedures on other enslaved women, sometimes drugging them to prevent resistance. Sims subjected Anarcha, an enslaved teenager, to at least 13 operations without anesthesia, before he developed a repair technique considered safe to attempt on white patients. Unable to refuse treatment or withhold consent, Lucy, Anarcha, and Sims's other enslaved patients were powerless against medical exploitation. During and after enslavement, physicians often denied black people basic dignity and personhood, reflecting the dehumanizing myth that black people were less sensitive to pain than white people. Although Sims was historically praised for his contributions to medicine, people are now acknowledging the cruel and inhumane treatment he inflicted on black women during his experiments. As a result of this reevaluation, a statue of Sims was removed from Central Park in New York City in April 2018, although another statue of him still remains at the Alabama state capitol. Number 3. Savage dogs were used to hunt runaway slaves. Escaped slaves presented a challenge for slaveholders, as they were difficult to track and potentially dangerous to apprehend. In response, plantation owners developed a terrifying solution, breeding vicious dogs specifically for the purpose of hunting down runaways. These dogs are often a mix of powerful breeds like bloodhounds and bulldogs. They were trained to track, attack, and capture escaped slaves with aggression. The use of these dogs instilled terror in the hearts of enslaved individuals as they became symbols of the brutality and dehumanization inherent in the slave system. In a twisted display of power, slaveholders often allowed the dogs to maul captured runaways, inflicting severe injuries before subduing the animals. This practice served not only as a form of punishment, but also as a chilling warning to other slaves who might contemplate escaping. Number 4. The Zong mass killing. In 1781, the captain of the slave ship Zong ordered the drowning of 132 enslaved Africans during their journey to Jamaica. Upon returning to England, the ship's owners sought compensation for their lost cargo from their insurer. The case might have been successful if not for Olaudah Equiano, a formerly enslaved man living in England. He learned of the Zong mass killing and brought it to the attention of an abolitionist friend, leading to a court case. Initially, the court ruled in favor of the ship owners, likening the enslaved Africans to animals that could be killed for the ship's safety. However, the insurance company appealed, and in the retrial, the court recognized the enslaved Africans as people, not property. Number 5, a black man owned slaves. In the 17th century, a black man named Anthony Johnson was brought to Virginia as an indentured servant. Indentured servitude is a type of labor arrangement where a person agrees to work for free for a set period of time in exchange for something like debt repayment or travel expenses. After Anthony had finished his indentured servitude, he eventually gained his freedom and acquired land and servants, even legally owning a black man named John Kazor for life. This has been used by some to argue that slavery was not rooted in racism, but rather economics, as a black man was also a slave owner. However, this story is quite misleading. The first documented case of a lifetime enslavement in the colonies was that of John Punch, a black man sentenced to lifetime servitude for attempting to escape his indenture in 1640. His white companions who escaped with him received only additional years on their indenture. Doesn't this show the early unequal treatment for black individuals? His descendants were ultimately dispossessed of their land and likely lost their freedom due to increasing anti-black racism in the colony. While Johnson's story is unique, it is often misused to downplay the role of racism in American slavery. Number 6, slaves were branded like cattle. Branding enslaved people was a brutal practice used by slave owners throughout history, including in the American colonies. Branding was not only a way to mark property, but also a form of punishment and dehumanization. The practice dates back to ancient times and was used extensively during the transatlantic slave trade. Abolitionists highlighted the brutality of branding to expose the inhumanity of slavery. Different methods were employed, with heated irons being the most common, but acid and gunpowder were also used in some cases. Branding left lasting physical and psychological scars on enslaved individuals, a constant reminder of their dehumanization. As such, some individuals attempted to alter or remove their brands as a form of resistance and defiance. Number 7, African sold slaves. The Atlantic slave trade involved the active participation of African rulers and traders who sold fellow Africans, often prisoners of war, to European slave ships. This exchange was not one-sided, as African leaders received valuable European goods, particularly weapons, in return for slaves. These weapons facilitated further conquests, leading to a cycle of warfare and enslavement within Africa. Contrary to popular belief, the initial trade between Europeans and Africans did not involve slaves. African rulers initially traded ivory and gold for European goods. However, the demand for slave labor in the Americas led to a shift in this trade, with enslaved Africans becoming a significant commodity in the exchange. This contributed to the devastating impact of the slave trade on African societies, fueling conflict and instability for centuries. Number 8, free black individuals were abducted and sold back into slavery. The Underground Railroad, a network of safe houses aiding enslaved people in their escape to freedom, emerged before the Civil War. However, a counter-network known as the Reverse Underground Railroad arose in response. This system involved kidnapping runaway slaves and free black individuals in the North, transporting them to the South, and selling them back into slavery. These kidnapped free blacks faced immense challenges in proving their freedom due to biased court systems that often dismissed their documentation as forged. Additionally, laws prohibiting blacks from testifying against whites in court further hampered their ability to defend themselves. The Reverse Underground Railroad is one of the persistent threats of re-enslavement faced by black individuals, even in supposedly free states, and the systemic racism embedded within the legal system. Number 9, 25-year-old men were the best slaves. Slaveholders, driven by the pursuit of profit, provided enslaved individuals with only the bare minimum for survival, forcing them to toil from dawn till dusk. In a perverse twist, young women were often valued more than men until puberty due to their potential to bear children who would also be enslaved. The most valuable slaves were considered to be men around 25 years old, due to their perceived peak physical ability and potential for labor output. This callous disregard for human life and the reduction of individuals to mere commodities proves the dehumanizing nature of slavery. The value placed on enslaved people was not based on their inherent worth as human beings, but rather on their potential for economic exploitation. This commodification of human life was a fundamental aspect of the slave system, shaping the experiences of enslaved individuals and perpetuating the cycle of oppression. Number 10. Slave owners used a different kind of Bible just to justify slavery. In an attempt to indoctrinate enslaved people into Christianity while maintaining control, slaveholders in the British West Indies created a heavily edited version of the Bible known as the Slave Bible. This version excluded passages that could potentially inspire rebellion, such as the Israelites' exodus from Egypt, and emphasized stories that seemed to normalize slavery, like the tale of Joseph's enslavement. The Slave Bible served as a tool of manipulation, aiming to quell any thoughts of resistance among the enslaved population. The creators of this altered text, whether plantation owners or missionaries, sought to instill a sense of acceptance of their subjugated status in the slaves. This act of religious censorship highlights the lengths to which those in power would go to maintain control and suppress dissent. Number 11. Fleeing slaves were considered mentally ill. Samuel Cartwright, a physician in the pro-slavery American South, used his medical expertise to uphold the institution of slavery. He published a report that falsely claimed black people were biologically inferior to whites, with smaller brains and immature nervous systems, making them naturally suited for servitude. He even went so far as to assert that black individuals could only find happiness in slavery. In a blatant attempt to pathologize resistance, Cartwright invented a mental disorder called drapetomania, supposedly afflicting slaves who attempted to escape their masters. He prescribed inhumane treatments for this fake condition, including whippings and amputations. Number 12. Slaves' laziness was also considered a mental disorder. Not content with inventing drapetomania, Samuel Cartwright also fabricated another fictitious mental disorder called dysesthesia ethiopica, which he falsely claimed caused laziness in enslaved people. According to Cartwright, this condition stemmed from decreased skin sensitivity, leading to sluggishness and a perceived lack of effort. Cartwright paradoxically asserted that this illness was more prevalent in free black individuals due to a supposed lack of care from masters. His proposed cure involved washing the affected skin, applying oil, and forcing the person to work under the sun, after which he believed they would be thankful. Number 13. Black people were arrested for being unemployed. The abolition of slavery after the Civil War caused economic instability in the South, where the economy heavily relied on slave labor. However, a loophole in the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery except as punishment for a crime, was exploited by Southern states. They began arresting black individuals indiscriminately, often for minor offenses or even unemployment, leading to their imprisonment and subsequent leasing to private businesses for forced labor. This convict leasing system effectively replaced slavery, subjecting over 200,000 black people to brutal working conditions and inhumane treatment. The leased convicts were forced to perform dangerous tasks under harsh conditions, enduring whippings and chains. In other words, black people were arrested for doing nothing. Number 14. The continuation of the illegal slave trade. Despite the formal end of the slave trade, illicit trafficking persisted, yielding substantial profits for those involved. During the 19th century, an estimated 1.65 million enslaved Africans were transported across the Atlantic, frequently on American vessels, revealing the continued involvement of governments and corporations in this abhorrent trade. The illegal slave trade had a devastating impact on African societies, leading to increased violence, instability, and economic disruption. The capture and forced migration of millions of people disrupted communities, fueled conflicts, and hindered the development of local economies. Number 15. Slave quarters were horrible. Slave quarters were the housing provided to enslaved people on plantations and farms during the era of slavery in the United States. These dwellings varied greatly depending on location, time period, and the slave owner's wealth. The most common type was the one-room cabin, often made of wood or logs with dirt floors and minimal amenities. Some enslaved people lived in larger structures divided into units, while others inhabited converted outbuildings. Overcrowding, poor construction, and lack of basic sanitation were common, leading to unsanitary conditions and the spread of disease. enslaved people suffered from a range of health problems and psychological trauma due to these harsh living conditions. The lack of privacy and autonomy further exacerbated their plight. Number 16. Slave codes. These were laws that treated enslaved people as property rather than human beings. The laws aimed to protect slave owners from potential uprisings or violence by limiting the rights and freedoms of enslaved individuals. This included controlling their movement, assembly, education, and family life. Back then, the threat of slave rebellions was a constant concern for slave owners, leading to the enactment of harsher and more restrictive slave codes over time. These laws not only regulated the behavior of enslaved people, but also defined their legal status based on race. Any person with African ancestry, regardless of their free or enslaved status, was considered black under these codes. Additionally, the status of a child followed that of the mother, meaning that if a mother was enslaved, her child would be as well, even if the father was free. The specific provisions of slave codes varied across colonies and states, but they all shared the common goal of maintaining the institution of slavery and the racial hierarchy it relied on. These codes ultimately stripped enslaved people of their basic human rights and subjected them to a life of oppression and exploitation. Number 17. The domestic slave trade. In 1808, the United States Congress prohibited the importation of African slaves, a move hailed by abolitionists as a step towards justice. However, this seemingly progressive act had unintended consequences. It inadvertently fueled the growth of a domestic slave trade, a cruel system that tore families apart and displaced an estimated 1.2 million individuals, most of whom were born in America. This internal trade cast a long shadow over the lives of enslaved people. The constant threat of being sold and separated from loved ones created a pervasive atmosphere of fear and uncertainty. The prospect of being sent to the harsh conditions of the Louisiana sugar plantations, with their grueling labor and high mortality rates, was a terrifying reality for many. Number 18. The Underground Railroad. In the era of slavery, the Underground Railroad was a network of routes and safe havens that facilitated the escape of enslaved people from the American South to the North. The term Underground Railroad was metaphorical, as it was not an actual railroad and did not run underground. Instead, it facilitated long-distance escapes through homes, barns, churches, and businesses. The people involved in the Underground Railroad were driven by a profound commitment to justice and the abolition of slavery, and their dedication was so strong that they risked their own lives and freedom to assist enslaved people in their journey to safety. Between 1810 and 1850, the Underground Railroad helped guide 100,000 enslaved people to freedom. Conductors led runaway enslaved people from one location to another along the routes. The safe places that provided shelter were known as stations, and those who hid the escapees were called station masters. The escaping individuals were referred to as passengers, and once they reached the safe houses, they were termed cargo. Number 19. Slave labor in urban and rural settings. Enslaved individuals were not limited to rural plantations. They also played a significant role in the labor force of urban areas like Boston, New York, Charleston, Richmond, and Baltimore, demonstrating the widespread nature of slavery throughout various settings. In urban areas, enslaved people worked in a variety of occupations, including domestic service, skilled trades, and industrial labor. They were blacksmiths, carpenters, seamstresses, cooks, and laundresses, contributing to the economic development of these cities. Despite their essential role in urban life, enslaved individuals in cities faced unique challenges, including limited social mobility and increased surveillance. Number 20. Resistance and the fight for abolition. Enslaved Africans never stopped fighting for their freedom. Their spirit was strong, and their resistance gave hope to others facing oppression. They fought back in many ways, from small acts of defiance to large-scale rebellions. Their bravery and determination inspired generations to fight for their own liberation. One powerful example of this was the Haitian Revolution in the late 1700s. Enslaved people in the French colony of Saint-Domingue rose up against their oppressors, ultimately overthrowing French rule and declaring their independence. They renamed their nation Haiti, and this act sparked many more revolutions to end slavery in all of France's colonies. Number 21. Resistance and revolts aboard slave ships. Enslaved Africans frequently resisted the brutal conditions aboard slave ships too, leading to rebellions on an estimated 10% of all voyages, especially near the African coast. They fought back against their captors using various tactics, such as refusing food and water, jumping overboard, and even organizing armed uprisings. These acts of defiance, though met with harsh reprisals, forced slave traders to increase security measures, inadvertently raising their costs and limiting the number of voyages they could undertake. Number 22. The terrifying impact of Nat Turner's revolt. Nat Turner's 1831 rebellion in Virginia struck terror into the hearts of slaveholders. A well-coordinated uprising led by a large group of black men resulted in the deaths of approximately 55 white people, exposing the vulnerability of the slave system and the potential for organized resistance. The aftermath of Turner's rebellion led to heightened paranoia and brutal reprisals against enslaved people across the South. States enacted stricter slave codes, further limiting the freedoms and rights of enslaved individuals. The uprising also intensified the debate over slavery, contributing to the growing divide between pro-slavery and abolitionist factions in the United States. Number 23. The East African slave trade continued into the 20th century. While the United States abolished the slave trade in 1808, the East African slave trade, also known as the Arab slave trade, persisted for much longer. Throughout the Indian Ocean region, slavery was considered morally and legally acceptable, regardless of the religious beliefs of those involved. Over 1 million slaves were taken from East Africa during the 19th century, and despite British efforts to suppress it, the trade continued into the 20th century. This highlights the global nature of slavery and the fact that its abolition was a gradual process, with some regions lagging far behind others in eradicating this inhumane practice. Number 24. The horrors of the Middle Passage. The Middle Passage, a nightmarish voyage across the Atlantic Ocean, was a living hell for those ensnared in its clutches. Stolen from their homeland and stripped of their dignity, men, women, and children alike were crammed into the bowels of slave ships, their naked bodies shackled and branded like cattle. The stench of human waste and disease surrounded the air as the captives endured unimaginable suffering. Death became a constant occurrence on this harrowing journey, claiming the lives of an estimated 12% of slaves. The brutality and despair were so profound that they ignited countless acts of rebellion, desperate attempts to reclaim a semblance of freedom, though these were often met with swift and merciless reprisals. Number 25. Modern slavery. In our modern world, slavery hasn't disappeared, it's simply changed its face. Instead of chains and plantations, it hides in plain sight as human trafficking, forced labor, and forced marriage. Being tricked, threatened, or even born into a life where freedom is stolen and exploited for someone else's profit. This isn't a horror story from the past. It's the chilling reality for an estimated 49.6 million people today, including a heartbreaking number of children. Poverty, lack of education, and social instability make certain groups more vulnerable to these horrors. Human trafficking, forced labor, and the cruel practice of forced marriage, modern slavery exists in various forms. It's hidden within complex supply chains, making it incredibly difficult to hold businesses accountable. This is why we need strong laws, government action, and global cooperation to put a spotlight on this darkness and protect the vulnerable. In the UK, the National Referral Mechanism is working tirelessly to identify and support victims, proving that the fight against modern slavery is happening on our own doorsteps. But let's not forget that this is a global issue, and we all have a role to play in ensuring that every human being has the right to live a life free from exploitation. It's a fight for freedom, dignity, and the fundamental values that make us human. We've just gone through 25 eye-opening facts about slavery, but the commemoration must not end with this video. May humanity continue to remember those who fought against their chains, for their stories are filled to the brim with both pain and bravery as they fought the never-ending fight for freedom. What we learn from these past horrors and present-day injustices should motivate us to take action. We need to keep learning, raising awareness, and actively fighting and put a stop once and for all against the exploitation that's still happening around the world. It's our responsibility to honor those who fought for freedom before us, both the abolitionists and the enslaved themselves. By working together, we can create a world where everyone is truly free. Thank you for staying until the end of the video. If you like this content, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any future uploads. Continue the discussion by commenting and sharing with your friends. We look forward to seeing you in the next video.